All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's Paid Family Leave Q&A webinar, specifically for employers. Over the years, paid family leave benefits have been significantly enhanced to further improve the lives of working New Yorkers and their families, including providing more time off, more uses for paid family leave, and more financial security. Today, we'll be reviewing some of the most frequently asked questions we've received from employers regarding New York's paid family leave benefit, and then spend the rest of the time answering any additional questions you may have. In today's presentation, we will provide a brief refresher on New York paid family leave and how it works, review the top most frequently asked questions from employers about paid family leave, and highlight the many resources available to you. And then, as mentioned, we will use the rest of the time to take any additional questions you may have. So let's get started. Paid family leave is insurance, which is fully covered by employee contributions collected through a small payroll deduction. This critical benefit provides job-protected paid time off to employees who need time away from their jobs to bond with a newly born, adopted, or fostered child, care for a family member with a serious health condition, or assist loved ones when a spouse, domestic partner, child, or parent is deployed abroad on active military service. Under legislation signed into law in March 2020, paid family leave now also provides paid time off and job protection so employees can care for themselves or their minor dependent child when under a mandatory order of quarantine or isolation due to COVID-19. The order must be issued by the State of New York, the Department of Health, local Board of Health, or any other government entity duly authorized to issue such order due to COVID-19. Paid family leave provides time off and wage benefits, which were gradually phased in over a 4-year period that started in 2018. At that time, paid family leave provided 8 weeks off at 50% pay up to a cap. Paid family leave is now fully phased in, and eligible employees can take up to 12 weeks of paid family leave at 67% of their average weekly wage, capped at 67% of the New York State average weekly wage. An employee's average weekly wage is based on their last 8 weeks of pay prior to taking paid family leave. For 2022, the New York State average weekly wage is $1,594.97. It's important to note that employees can take this paid time off all at once or intermittently, but it must always be in full day increments. Paid family leave is fully funded through employee contributions. Each year, the Department of Financial Services sets the employee contribution rate to match the cost of coverage. In 2022, the payroll contribution is 0.511% of an employee's gross wages each pay period. The maximum annual contribution is $423.71. If an employee earns less than the statewide average weekly wage, they will contribute less than the annual cap, consistent with their actual wages. So, to summarize the updates for 2022, the maximum weekly benefit has increased from $971.61 to $1,068.36. Also, as of January 1st, 2022, employers may continue deducting at the rate of 0.511% of an employee's gross wages each pay period, but it's capped at an annual maximum of $423.71. In 2021, the annual maximum cap was $385.34. For most employers with 10 or fewer employees and a business net annual income of less than $1 million, employees can use a combination of paid family leave and disability benefits. After receiving their PFL benefit, which is up to $804.70 weekly, employees will receive a benefit of $2,043.92 for a total of $2,884.62 per week. There is no waiting period for either benefit, and employees will have job protection for the duration of the quarantine. For most employers with 11 to 99 employees, or small employers, 1 to 10 employees, with a business net annual income greater than $1 million, you are required to provide at least 5 days of COVID-19 paid sick leave. Eligible employees can then use paid family leave. After receiving their paid family leave benefit, again up to $840.70 weekly, employees will receive disability benefits to match their full wages up to a maximum weekly disability benefit of $2,043.92 for a total of $2,884.62 per week. There is no waiting period for either benefit, and employees will have job protection for the duration of the quarantine. For most employers with 100 or more employees, as well as all public employers, you are required to provide at least 14 days of COVID-19 paid sick leave for a COVID-19 related quarantine, which should cover the period of a mandatory or precautionary order of quarantine or isolation. Employees, again, will have job protection for the duration of the quarantine. All right, now let's go over some of the most frequently asked questions we receive from employers regarding paid family leave. Question 1, must employees expend all other leave types before becoming eligible for PFL? The answer is no. Employers cannot require that employees use paid time off while they're on PFL. Employees cannot collect short-term disability and paid family leave benefits for the same period of time. A birth mother can, for example, take short-term disability if she qualifies and then paid family leave. It's important to note that the total amount of time taken for disability and paid family leave cannot exceed 26 weeks in any 52-week period. If an employee has an event that qualifies for leave under both FMLA and paid family leave, and you as the employer are covered under both laws, you can require the employee to take the leave concurrently. In order for the two types of leave to run together, you as the employer must notify the employee that their leave qualifies for both FMLA and paid family leave and that it will be designated as such. Question 2, if an employee's leave reason is covered under FMLA and paid family leave, can the employer require the employee to take paid time off at that time? The workers' compensation law does not allow employers to force employees to use accruals like vacation or PTO during PFL. However, the PFL regulations allow an employer to charge accruals in accordance with the provisions of the FMLA when FMLA and PFL are running concurrently. We do recommend that employers do not require employees to use accruals when FMLA and PFL are running concurrently, though. Question 3. If an employee has exhausted FMLA, does PFL grant them an additional 12 weeks of leave? An employer can require an employee to use PFL available with FMLA if it's available. If an employer notifies an employee that a period of FMLA also qualifies for PFL and the employee fails to file for those PFL benefits, the employer and insurance carrier can count the FMLA time against the employee's maximum PFL leave. If an employee uses FMLA for an event that doesn't qualify for PFL, the employee will still have PFL available. Question 4, can an employee opt out of PFL if they work over 20 hours per week? Paid family leave coverage is not optional for eligible employees. There are only two categories of employees who can waive coverage. Those who regularly work less than 20 hours per week but won't work 175 days in a year, or employees who regularly work 20 or more hours per week, but they won't be in employment with that employer for 26 consecutive weeks. Seasonal workers are a good example of this because they might work full-time but only for 3 months out of the year. If an employee meets the criteria for waiving coverage, the employer must provide them with a waiver form, which is also available on the Paid Family Leave website. Employees who properly file a waiver will not make contributions and will not be eligible for paid family leave benefits. Employers should keep a copy of an employee's waiver on file. Question 5, is there an employer matched fund for the payroll deduction, or is this solely funded by the employees? Paid family leave is solely funded through employee contributions. Each year, the Department of Financial Services sets the employee contribution rate to match the cost of coverage. In 2022, the payroll contribution is 0.511% of an employee's gross wages each pay period. The maximum annual contribution is $423.71. If an employee earns less than the statewide average weekly wage, they will contribute less than the annual cap consistent with their actual wages. Question 6, can an employee take PFL more than once a year due to unique qualifying events? An employee may choose to use paid family leave for more than one type of qualifying event. Employees may take up to 12 weeks of paid family leave in a 52-week period. An employee who has multiple qualifying events within a 52-week period is still limited to 12 weeks of paid family leave. Question 7, what is the process for submitting PFL request forms? Employees should provide employers with 30 days advance notice of their intent to use paid family leave if it's foreseeable. Employers should have forms available for employees. Employees must fill out Part A of the Request for Paid Family Leave, Form PFL-1, and employers must complete Part B of that form and return it to the employee within 3 business days. If employers fail to return the form within 3 business days, the employee can still submit the form directly to the insurance carrier without employer information. Are domestic workers eligible for paid family leave? Yes, they are. Governor Hochul recently signed an amendment to the workers' compensation law, which expands coverage for domestic workers. Previously, domestic workers were only required to be covered if they worked at least 40 hours a week for their employer. But as of January 1st, 2022, domestic workers who are hired directly by a private homeowner and who work 20 or more hours per week for the private homeowner are required to be covered for paid family leave. These workers are eligible once they've been in employment with that employer for 26 consecutive weeks. Are siblings covered under paid family leave for family care? Governor Hochul signed legislation on November 1st, 2021, expanding paid family leave to allow caring for a sibling with a serious health condition. This includes biological siblings, adopted siblings, step siblings, and half siblings. And the legislation goes into effect on January 1st, 2023. Question 10, how should employers address COVID-19 sick pay, paid sick leave, and paid family leave? Employers are required to provide a certain number of hours of paid sick leave depending on the size of the employer. When an employee is under an order of quarantine or isolation, an employer might be required to provide COVID-19 paid sick leave depending on the size of the employer. This is separate from regular paid sick leave and that the employer must provide. Some employees might also have paid family leave benefits available. Question 11, how many times can an employee take COVID-19 related leave? Employees may qualify for COVID-19 quarantine leave for up to 3 orders of quarantine or isolation, but the second and third orders of quarantine or isolation must be based on a positive COVID-19 test. Currently, there are no time restraints on the 3 orders of quarantine. Question 12, if an employer offers paid sick leave, do they still need to pay for COVID leave? And the answer is yes. COVID-19 paid sick leave is in addition to any other paid sick leave or accrual, PTO, that an employer might offer. Question 14, can employees use COVID-19 leave to take time to get tested for COVID-19? The New York State COVID-19 quarantine leave benefits are only available when an employee or their minor dependent child are actually subject to an order of quarantine or isolation. Question 15, is there any recourse if you suspect an employee is abusing PFL? If an employer believes that an employee is abusing paid family leave, the employer should immediately contact their paid family leave insurance carrier to notify them of the situation. The paid family leave insurance carrier will determine whether the employee's paid family leave benefits are affected. As we continue working closely with employers to ensure successful implementation of paid family leave throughout New York State, there are several resources to help. Complete details on paid family leave are available at paidfamilyleave.ny.gov, along with opt-in, request, and waiver forms, fact sheets, and weekly benefit and payroll deduction calculators. We've also created a special Updates for 2022 page available at paidfamilyleave.ny.gov/2022 with several employer resources to help explain and communicate benefit and deductions changes. These include an overview of the changes, FAQs, an updated employee statement of rights, updated model language that can be used for an employee handbook or other written materials, and a template to use to notify employees of their payroll deduction amount. We strongly encourage employers to inform employees of their new deduction amount. Employers and employees can also contact the Paid Family Leave Helpline at 844-337-6303 for assistance Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. If you are not already subscribed for email updates on paid family leave, you can subscribe by clicking Get Paid Family Leave Updates on the bottom of the paidfamilyleave.ny.gov homepage. Finally, we also want to make you aware of the board's Advocate for Business. The Advocate for Business is the liaison between New York's business community and the Workers' Compensation Board, giving employers one place to contact for answers to their workers' compensation questions, as well as any questions that employers may have about paid family leave as it relates to your business. You can contact the Advocate for Business office at advocatebusiness@wcb.ny.gov. We hope you found this presentation helpful, and now we'll use the rest of the time to take your questions.
Thanks, Courtney. Again, please enter any questions you may have in the chat box. I do want to say I see a couple questions in here already. We will be providing you with a copy of this presentation, both a PDF version of the slide deck as well as a recording that will be posted on our YouTube page. Make sure you are signed up for paid family leave updates to your email. If you go to the website paidfamilyleave.ny.gov, you should see at the bottom of the homepage there's a button that says get, I believe it's just get updates, and then you can enter your email and you should be receiving any emails of any webinar announcements or when this presentation is available. I'm going to go back to the screen, or the slide I should say, that has our helpline and information on there to have you look at that if you need to write it down. We're going to take a brief period of silence now to review some of the questions that are coming in, but we will be back with you shortly, and thank you.
Our first question here is it the case that PFL is not applicable to teachers and therefore not available to faculty members at higher ed institutions? So the answer is that there's no blanket exemption for teachers. There is a carve-out in the law for if it's a not-for-profit institution. So persons engaged in a professional or teaching capacity for a not-for-profit are not required to be covered for disability and paid family leave. So it's possible that that's what you've heard. They're not required to be covered. They may be voluntarily covered. So I see a question here talking about the section of the law that says that paid family leave is only considered part of the same qualifying event if the days are separated by less than 3 months. If it's more than 3 months, they're considered separate paid family leave. And the question wants to know if self-insured employers are exempt from this rule, or are they required to have employees file new PFL requests? So the board can't provide legal advice, which includes claim-specific guidance. So I'm not going to be able to tell you what you should do in terms of your business practices or claim-specific guidance. But the law does say that one period of PFL is only considered one period of PFL if the days of leave are separated by less than 3 months. So if they're separated by more than 3 months, they are considered different qualifying events. Our next question here is, for new employees, do we start the PFL deductions immediately upon hire or not until they are eligible? So the answer is that unless the employee is eligible for a waiver, in which case you are required to offer them a waiver before you take any deductions. But assuming they don't qualify for a waiver, you can start taking deductions upon hire because you can take deductions in accordance with Section 209 of the Workers' Compensation Law. And that is to cover the cost of having that employee on your PFL policy. So if the employee doesn't qualify for a waiver, you can start taking deductions upon hire. I see a question here asking if COVID-19 leave is in addition to existing sick leave provided, and the answer is yes. COVID-19 paid sick leave for employers who are required to provide it is in addition to any other paid sick leave, PTO, vacation, any other paid time off that the employer already offers. What if an employee has a full-time job and qualifies for PFL under us? Do we still need to take out for PFL? So if your question is if you're required to take deductions from the employee, the answer is you're not required to take deductions from the employee, but you are entitled to, as long as it's from wages in accordance with Section 209, because paid family leave is fully funded by employees. So you can take deductions from your employees that are covered for paid family leave to cover the cost of having them on your policy. Our next question here is it required that employees give notice before going out on paid family leave? The answer is yes. So employees are required to provide at least 30 days notice if the leave is foreseeable. So if it's foreseeable that they should have known about it, they're required to give you 30 days notice. If the leave isn't foreseeable, if it's like an emergency or something like that, they're required to give you as much notice as possible. Our next question here is, it is our understanding that PFL days have to be taken in full day increments. We have an employee who wanted to use PTO to supplement, and the employee is now telling us we can combine partial days used to equal 1 full day and reinstate her PTO. Is this correct? If you're asking about FMLA, you can look at the regulation. It's 380-2.5 of the PFL regulations. So it's 12 NYCRR 380-2.5. And there is information in there about taking partial days of FMLA and deducting a day of paid family leave once they reach a full day, but I'm not sure that that's what you're talking about. If you're just talking about PFL, an employee can top up to receive full wages while they're on PFL, but they're still using full days of PFL. So PFL can only be taken in full day increments. 1 year, but then not the next 2 years. Is the employer responsible to notify them that they're no longer eligible so that they'll fill out the waiver? So PFL eligibility is just, once they reach eligibility, they're eligible forever until their employment with that employer terminates. So if, for example, this is someone who worked full-time, 40 hours a week for a year, they became eligible after 26 consecutive weeks of employment, and then they dropped down to part-time and now they only work once a week or something like that. They're still eligible for paid family leave. Once you reach eligibility for PFL, you stay eligible until your employment terminates. Our next question is asking if an employer is responsible to provide waiver information and track employee hours to see if they're eligible to waive. The answer is yes, it is the employer's responsibility. If an employee's schedule falls into one of the 2 categories that qualifies for a waiver, they're required to offer the waiver before they take deduction. So they are required to offer a waiver to employees to qualify. So it is the employer's responsibility to make that determination. Next question here is asking if an employee can take 12 weeks from FMLA for their own serious health condition and then after that use 12 weeks of PFL for a family member's condition. The answer is that's possible. So I can't make a determination if a particular employee is eligible, but that is a possible scenario. Paid family leave is not available for your own serious health condition. So if someone is taking 12 weeks of FMLA for their own serious health condition, that is not going to be run concurrently with PFL because that is not a qualifying event for PFL. So it is possible that someone could take 12 weeks of FMLA for themselves and then later need to use 12 weeks for someone else, and that is possible. Our next question is asking what an employer should do if an employee is out on PFL and then they were called about overtime and they answer that call and want to work. So the employee can't do that. I can't provide legal advice, so I can't tell you what you should do. But a day of paid family leave is defined in the regulations as a full day that the employee was prevented from performing work for the covered employer because they use paid family leave. So they're not allowed to work for that employer during a period of paid family leave. Our next question is, can an employer prorate an associate's PTO for the period of time they took PFL? And the answer is no. Paid family leave, an employer cannot require an employee to use their accruals during PFL. So if they're only taking PFL, that is a benefit that is separate. It should not affect their PFL, and you cannot force them to take their PTO during PFL. Our next question is, can an employee take bonding leave if the baby is born before they are eligible? So the answer is, if they're not eligible, they cannot take paid family leave, but bonding leave can be taken and completed at any time within the first year of the child's birth or placement for adoption or foster care. So just because they're not eligible immediately doesn't mean that they're never going to be able to take bonding leave, but they have to be eligible before they can take paid family leave. Okay, so I do see a few questions here that are asking for legal advice, like what should we do in this exact situation? And the board cannot provide legal advice. So we're not going to be able to tell you what you should do in a specific situation. So if you notice that your question has not been answered, that may be why, because we can't provide legal advice. So our next question here, part of it is asking for legal advice and part of it isn't. So I will, so the question here is, how can an employer return the section Part B within 3 days if the employee's request is future dated and pay information is not available? And then the second part is asking about holidays. So I'll take the holiday part. For the holidays and paid family leave are not explicitly addressed in the PFL law, and the board can't give legal advice. So holiday pay is just not addressed in the PFL law. For the first part, carriers are not required to accept pre-filed claims, meaning claims that are filed before the event happens. You're always free to contact your disability and PFL insurance carrier if you're unsure on how to fill something out, but I'm not going to be able to tell you how to or whether you should fill it out because, again, that would be legal advice. I see a question here asking if an employee meets the qualifications for the waiver but still wants PFL to come out of their check, is that okay? And is there a form we should have he or she sign? So the answer is that the waiver is voluntary. So an employee could choose to not opt out even though they qualify to opt out. And if they choose not, if you offer them the waiver and they just say, no, I don't want to sign it, you can take deductions from them and maybe eventually they would become eligible for PFL. There is no required form for either the waiver, we have a template waiver on our website that you can use, or to say that they've opted out. You're free to create one if you would like, so that you have a record. But if you offer an employee a waiver and they say no, you can take deductions from them. Our next question here is a question from an employer who had an employee who was under an order of quarantine. The employer is required to pay 5 days of COVID paid sick leave, and the question is how many days of PFL will the employee get? So the PFL portion, after someone has taken the 5 days of paid sick leave, if they're still under an order of quarantine, they might be eligible for paid family leave. But the COVID-19 quarantine leave benefits are only available while the employee is under an order of quarantine or isolation. Our next question here is, does the employee submit the request to the insurance company or can the employer submit it on their behalf? It is the employee's responsibility to send it to the insurance carrier. So it really should be the employee. Our next question here is asking if employees are required to provide 30 days notice for intermittent leave for bonding. The answer is if it's foreseeable, they are required to provide 30 days notice, and the employer can require notice, as much notice as possible before each day of intermittent leave as well. Our next question is, should PFL be tracked year to year, or is it a recurring year, earning days as they become available? So if I'm understanding this correctly, this is kind of asking how do employees, if they've used paid family leave, when do they have more PFL become available to them? And the answer is that PFL is a rolling calendar. So for each day of leave, the carrier is going to look back 52 weeks and see how much leave has been taken in the preceding 52 weeks. So the maximum is 12 weeks of PFL in a 52-week period, and the 52-week period is it's a rolling calendar. So it's not a calendar year. I see a few questions here asking about how to count things for payroll and whether they should be removed for payroll in different spots. And the board is not going to be able to assist you with your payroll administration. You can contact your payroll administrator. You can contact your carrier if you're not sure, but I can't give legal advice and I can't give guidance on your business practices. Our next question here is, can you use PTO with PFL? So an employer can't force an employee to use PTO during a period of PFL, but they can offer it if the employee wants to so that they receive full pay and the employer allows that, they can do that. And if they're using their PTO and they're getting full wages, you can request reimbursement from the carrier, but you cannot force your employee to do that. Okay, so we have two questions from the same employer here. The first one is, does the individual need to work the 8 weeks immediately preceding the PFL begin date? And the answer is no. Average weekly wage is going to be calculated using the last 8 weeks that the employee worked and received wages prior to the period of PFL. But there's no requirement that an eligible employee work right up to the, they work on the Friday and then they take PFL starting on the Monday. That's not a requirement. They just have to be in employment and eligible. For example, a lot of people would take disability after giving birth and then take paid family leave, and that's fine. So the next question that this person had was, can an employee backdate a request for PFL? I'm not sure what this is asking exactly. Carriers are not required to accept pre-filed claims, so a lot of times the request might be submitted after the qualifying event starts, and employees have 30 days from the first day of leave to apply before they risk losing benefits. So if by backdating you mean that they started leave and then they applied, as long as it's within 30 days and they're sending it to the carrier, that they're not going to get penalized for that. I see a question here asking if employers are going to be reimbursed for the COVID-19 paid sick leave. So in this case, it's someone who is required to provide 14 days of COVID paid sick pay. At this time, there is no reimbursement provision in the law. It's a benefit that the employers are required to pay, and currently in the law, there is no reimbursement. Our next question here is asking about an employee who has been helping their elderly dad through a cataract surgery and has now asked about PFL. Can we cover time they took off previously under PFL, even if they just apply now? So as I was saying with the earlier question, employees do have 30 days from the first day of PFL to apply before they risk losing benefits. So if it's within the 30 days and they were taking time to bring their dad to appointments or doing something that qualifies for PFL and it's a serious health condition, their father would be considered a family member under the law. So if they qualify for PFL for those days that they took off and it's within 30 days, they can definitely apply and say that they took those days of PFL. If it's beyond 30 days, they can still apply, but they do risk losing benefits. So the deadline is 30 days from the first day of leave before you risk losing benefits.
Hi, I'm just going to jump in here. I see a question from someone asking about additional webinars. The board does offer additional webinars on not only paid family leave, but also COVID-19 and any other workers' compensation related subjects. If you go to the workers' compensation website at wcb.ny.gov, there's a section on the bottom of the website for webinars. You can see all the webinars we have listed. I can tell you we do have a webinar focused on COVID-19 coming up next week. We also have additional paid family leave webinars that you can find for leave-specific types, employers, employees. If you go to the paid family leave website and go to the webinar section there.
Our next question is, if we are paying the employee contributions on behalf of the employees and we want to transition to taking contributions, are there steps we would have to take? So the answer is that if you're voluntarily covering those employees, there is a form that you would have to fill out. It's either the PFL 135 or the PFL 136. One is no contributions, one is contributions, and I just cannot remember which one it is. That's voluntary coverage, and that's available on the website. That's on the screen. But if it's someone who is required to be covered, and you haven't been taking deductions and you want to start, we do strongly recommend that you notify employees before you start taking deductions. but you can take deductions from employees in accordance with Section 209 of the Workers' Compensation Law. Our next question is, if an employee does not provide 30 days notice, a full 30 days notice, is it up to the employer or the carrier to approve or deny the claim? In this case, the leave was foreseeable. So it is the carrier's decision, not the employer's, to approve or deny a claim. So it's always going to be up to the carrier, never the employer. If you believe that the leave was not sufficient, or that the notice was not sufficient, and you think that there should be a partial denial, you're free to contact the carrier, but it is the carrier's decision. We have a question here. How does intermittent PFL work? So there are two ways that you can take PFL. One is intermittently and one is continuously. So continuously would be something like, I'm bonding with my child and I'm taking 12 weeks off, all in a row. Intermittent PFL has to be taken in full day increments, but it would be something less than 12 weeks. It would be, I'm taking every Monday and Wednesday because my dad has dialysis and I have to take him to the treatment center or something like that. So intermittent PFL is just taken in full day increments on something less than a continuous scale. So if you normally work 5 days a week, maybe you need 3 days a week of PFL, something like that. Our next question here is, if an employee was going to take time for bonding all at once, but then later decides they want to take the remaining time at the holidays, can the employer decline the request because it's difficult to cover positions during the holidays? The answer is no. An employee who is eligible for PFL can take PFL, and they can take it however they want to split it up. So for bonding leave, it just has to be taken and completed within the first 12 months of the child's birth or placement for adoption or foster care. But the employer, there is no ability for the employer to deny leave because it's a difficult time of year. If the employee is eligible for PFL, they can take PFL. I see a question here. I think it's a follow-up to a previous question. So if you yourself are ill or going for treatments, you are not eligible for your PFL, just FMLA. And the answer is correct. PFL does not qualify, like your own serious health condition does not qualify for PFL. So if you need treatments, if you need time off for surgery or something like that, that does not qualify for PFL. It might qualify for statutory disability, depending on how long you're out of work, but it wouldn't qualify for PFL. It may qualify for FMLA, but FMLA is federal, and we don't have jurisdiction, so I can't say that you are definitely eligible for FMLA, but for your own serious health condition, you would not be eligible for PFL, but you might be eligible for New York State disability. Our next question is, can you collect PFL from 2 different employers? And the answer is, if you're eligible at 2 different employers, yes. You're not required, an employee isn't required to take leave if they're eligible for multiple employers. They don't have to take leave from them, but for example, for bonding leave, if they want to take bonding leave, they have to take it from every employer that they're eligible with at the same time. So you couldn't take 12 weeks with employer A and then 12 weeks with employer B. You have to take it at the same time, and you're still limited to 12 weeks. But eligibility, deduction amount, benefit amount, those are all calculated separately per covered employer, and you could potentially take it from multiple employers. So the next question is asking if I can provide the rule or statute regarding employer responsibilities for notifying an employer of PFL rights and responsibilities. So the regulation is 12 NYCRR, and then it's Part 380-7, and there's kind of a bunch of different sections, but Part 380-7 is where you'll find the employer rights and responsibilities, but the easiest way to find all of them is to look on the Paid Family Leave website. So it's on the screen, and then if you click employers, then there's an employer rights and responsibilities section right on the website, and that'll give you kind of everything that you need to know. Our next question is, if a married couple works at the same employer, can they each take 12 weeks of PFL, or is it combined? So two employees who work at the same employer, an employer is not required to allow them to take leave for the same qualifying event at the same time. So, for example, if it's a married couple and they have a child and they want to take bonding leave, the employer can require them to take the leave separately if they are trying to take it at the same time. Like, the employer can allow them to take it separately, but they can require them to take it, or to take it at the same time, I'm sorry. But they can require them to take it separately if they work for the same employer and they're trying to take leave at the same time for the same family member. Then you can require them to take it separately. Otherwise, they're still eligible. If they're eligible, they're eligible for 12 weeks of PFL. It's just a matter of if they have to take it at the same time or separately. But if, for example, they're taking it for two different qualifying events, but it would be at the same time, they can take it at the same time in that case. So our next question here is, what if the max benefit doesn't reach the employee's salary? How do you make up the difference if you can't force them to use PTO? So the PFL benefit is 67% of an employee's average weekly wage, capped at 67% of the statewide average weekly wage. That's the benefit. If an employee wants to get full salary, you can offer them to use their PTO so that they get full salary, but the benefit is the 67%. And if the employee only wants to receive 67%, that's fine. As both FMLA and PFL, I think meaning that they are subject to both, but has exhausted their FMLA because they took it all in less than 8-hour increments, do they still have to notify the insurance carrier? So if I'm understanding this question correctly, I think you're asking if someone has already used all of their FMLA, can they still take PFL? And the answer is yes. You can force an employee to take FMLA and PFL for the same qualifying event at the same time, but only if they have FMLA available to them and PFL available to them. So if someone doesn't have FMLA available to them, that does not affect their eligibility for PFL at all. Our next question here is, if the employee has to be employed with the employer when they become a new parent to take bonding leave, or if they had the baby before they were employed, can they still qualify for bonding leave? So if they become eligible for PFL, so if they work 20 or more hours per week, if they are in employment for 26 consecutive weeks or less than 20 hours and they worked 175 days, so once they meet that requirement, if they still have a child that's within the year, an employee can take and complete PFL bonding at any time within the first year of the child's birth or placement for adoption or foster care. So it is possible that someone could have a baby, start a job, become eligible, then take bonding leave all before the 1-year date passes, so that it's possible. Employer and works more than 20 hours per week and is scheduled to be in employment for more than 26 weeks. Can they still opt out since they haven't worked yet 26 weeks and therefore they're not eligible yet? The answer is no. The waiver qualifications are for an employee who regularly works 20 or more hours per week. They're only eligible for waiver if they won't be in employment for 26 consecutive weeks. So like a seasonal worker, for example. Our next question is, if an employee moves out of state and now works remotely from that state, should we guide that employee to opt out? So if an employee works out of state, so let me back up. To be eligible for PFL, you have to be in employment in New York State. And to be in employment in New York State essentially means that you have to work in New York State. So you have to be localized in New York, it's called, and there is a test in the law. But if the employee does not work in New York State, like they have moved out of state and their new job, they work entirely out of state, they're not covered. They wouldn't be considered in employment, and therefore they're not a covered employee for New York State paid family leave. So employees who work outside of New York State are not eligible for New York State paid family leave. Our next question here is, if an employee is eligible for PFL and takes 12 weeks of PFL, but they're not yet eligible for FMLA, for example, they were employed for 7 months, when are they able to take FMLA? So FMLA is federal. The board does not have jurisdiction over federal law. My understanding is that the eligibility is a year with a certain number of hours worked. So whenever they become eligible for FMLA, they would be eligible. The eligibility for PFL and eligibility for FMLA are completely unrelated. PFL is New York State, FMLA is federal, and the eligibility requirements are totally separate and unrelated. Our next question is, can an employee collect PFL in addition to a company's paid parental benefit? For example, 100% of their pay for 4 weeks plus PFL. So an employee cannot receive more than 100% of their wages during a period of PFL. And how PFL and an employer parental policy work is going to depend on the specifics of your employer policy. But the law does say that an employee should not be receiving more than 100% of their pay while they're on PFL. Our next question here is, if an employee doesn't have benefits at their job, can they still qualify for PFL? And the answer is yes. It's just the eligibility requirements for PFL are for someone who regularly works 20 or more hours per week. Once they've been in employment for 26 consecutive weeks, then they're eligible for PFL if they're covered. And then if they work less than 20 hours per week, it would be after they work 175 days in the employment of a covered employer. Our next question is, can the employer control when the employee takes bonding leave? Generally, the answer is no. An eligible employee can choose when or whether to take PFL, including bonding leave. The only exception to that would be if the employer is subject to FMLA and PFL, and they're designating time off as FMLA, they can also require the employee to take PFL during the same time period, assuming that they have FMLA and PFL available to them, and it's for the same qualifying event. Our next question is asking if all employers have COVID covered under PFL after the 2 weeks. And the answer is no. Like, large employers have, it's the 2 weeks of COVID-19 paid sick leave, and public employers, and the PFL is not part of that. And PFL is available is the job protected. So PFL does have job protection independent of FMLA. So if the employee is eligible for PFL and they're taking PFL, that is job protected leave regardless of whether or not they're also taking FMLA.
All right. Thank you, Courtney. And thank you, everyone, for asking some pretty good questions. It is 1 o'clock, so we do have to cut it short, unfortunately. If you did not get your question answered, again, the helpline is right on your screen there if you want to write it down. We also encourage you to visit the Paid Family Leave website. There's a plethora of information on there that you can hopefully receive an answer to your question on. Again, this presentation will be presented in a recording, and we will post a copy of the slide deck on our site. So make sure you're signed up for notifications so you're aware when those are available. As a reminder, you can sign up for those notifications by going to the Paid Family Leave website, scroll down to the bottom of the homepage and select Get Paid Family Leave Updates. We do also distribute information on social media, so along with our YouTube page, please be sure to follow the Workers' Compensation Board on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.